Good evening, family. Thank you guys so much for coming out again. Mr. Swella, thank you so much for food and blessing us. Everyone, thank you guys for being here. Elders are here tonight. Blessed to have them here. I know we're missing quite a few tonight, but we'll go ahead and get started. Dive into Nehemiah tonight. So looking forward to that. We're going to ask Mojo if he'll lead us in prayer. I think Miss Molly, her first time being here, so let's thank God for Molly being here tonight. Mojo, if you'll work for us.
Dear Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be in your house once again tonight, oh God. Just help us tonight to glean from your word, oh God, and Lord, speak to us as you never have before, oh God. Lord, we thank you for all our fellow believers here tonight, God. Thank you for this circle of one and all. We thank you that you're the God of this circle. Lord, just bless this time together. We give you all the praise, Lord.
Can we welcome Mr. David Johnson?
So glad you're here.
I'm so glad I'm here. Ken is glad, otherwise he'd be covering this up. Sometimes I'm louder than I want to be because I try to be around the noise back here. We're trying to cool the room back down a little bit. Once upon a time, I was a teacher and in a classroom.
Last Wednesday.
Yeah, last Wednesday. I'm not sure about that. That's a generous definition for last Wednesday. And I had 1 year, I was teaching 8th graders, which is always interesting. And I had learned that some people just like to distract the teacher. I started my teaching career as a long-term sub for seniors in the spring of their senior year, the last 2 periods of the day. Now, there's something called senioritis, which is when the sap rises and their head swells and they don't care for anybody. So I did a little intel on this. Actually, I haven't for the last 3 months, but I did a little intel, and when I walked in as the sub, I had memorized every single person's name before I walked into the room. So when I called them out by name, they couldn't hide behind anonymity. So at one point, I got their attention very fast, and we had a great time together, and I got a job out of that long-term sub thing. But was teaching 8th graders, and I came across this idea that every time they wanted to raise a question that 8th graders are prone to do, which is this kind of weird, off this subject, that I would have somebody in the room be my record keeper. And they had a book, and their job was any crazy question that wasn't on subject got put in the book. And every other last day of the week, for this particular class, it was a Thursday. Every other Thursday, we called it Whatever Goes Thursday. So the fun part in all that was that they wanted to distract me from teaching. And my answer is, I'll honor your question, but we're going to do it on this designated Thursday. So we would get the Thursday list, and we would open the list, and then I would have the recorder say, all right, what's on the list for Anything Goes Thursday? And they would go down the list, and I would have the person's name who raised the question. And I would say, do you still want to talk about that? And the answer almost inevitably was no. But we also found that some of the questions that were lingering were the most interesting conversations we had. And that was a very instructive thing for me, because it's in the learning process, it's not just what you're hearing, it's what you're thinking about that you want to put a note in the margin. And it's the note in the margin that actually you come back to and you read your note in the margin. You don't read the actual text anymore. That's always been instructive. I feel like tonight is kind of one of those anything goes Wednesday kind of nights. Not quite, but it feels like that. Because we do have a smaller group, and I love the opportunity for dialogue, questions. We are going to go a long ways tonight, Lord willing. So we're going to read a lot, Joey. And we'll see what happens here. Little review, all right? We saw that we are now approaching the walls. We will actually get through chapter 7 tonight. So 4, 5, 6, and 7. 7, quite frankly, is a bypass chapter because it's full of names. From verse 6 through verse 73 is a list of names. So we're really just going to go 4, 5, and 6. And these are the critical chapters. And then over the next couple of weeks, we'll finish up with this section here. As you can see, these three here are this explained. So these are not, this is all explanation of this section here, which is kind of once you've got the city up and running and you've rebuilt the walls, what's the purpose of doing it? You've got to see beyond the project. All right, and we saw this last week, and I just want to illustrate, there's a couple of versions out in the mainstream about what does the city of Jerusalem look like in about 444 BC. This is the more narrow view. The original city of David is down here to the south, and then it went north toward the Temple Mount, which would have been the temple that was rebuilt under Zerubbabel, which then was followed by Ezra, that then is followed by Nehemiah. So the question is to come back in and rebuild these walls. And we saw last week, and I'll show you in just a moment, to the north end is the sheep gate, because it's the gate where all the sheep, it's a one-way trip, as I said, because they would come into the city for worship, the people would, and the sheep would come in for sacrifice. So the sheep gate was a one-way. One of the miracles of Jesus takes place near the sheep gate. So we know that these were up and operational during the time of Jesus. This is one version of that, maybe what it looked like. A little bit different version. Obviously, it's much more boxy looking, but it's easy to kind of see where we are. We saw last week that he began with the sheep gate, the temple, personnel, the priest, and the assistants all focused on this gate. And everyone is going to walk around. He's actually in chapter 3, goes all the way around the city, back up to the sheep gate, and that's how he concludes chapter 3. What's significant about the project, and we'll see a little bit more tonight, is that every one of these sections is where the people were working, and the landmarks are the reference point that everyone is embedded along the way. And I'll show you in just a moment that he took everyone that was a part of this project, and near where they lived is where they worked. So if their house was over here, then they would work on this section. If their home was over here, they'd work on this section. In other words, Nehemiah had arranged things so that the people had a vested interest that their gate would look good, or their section of the wall would look good. I think that's a very important part. I've been in, and I know that the pastors have been on mission trips in the past at churches. It's amazing to see in some of the more poor neighborhoods, even where it appears to be abjectly impoverished, people still want their little part of the world to look good. I went to a slum in Costa Rica, and within a square mile there were 200,000 Nicaraguan refugees that had fled the Sandinistas and had settled in this small village next to a dump. It was a landfill. And street after street after street was a shanty. And trash was everywhere in the street, but as you went to every home, every house, they had made it look good. And what they had done is they had cleaned up their house by throwing everything that they didn't like in the street. So I'm walking through the street going, this is terrible. And then you look in the window and goes, that doesn't look too bad in there. They had no sanitation, and here they were living next to this landfill, but their own places were terrible, but their homes were decent. It was amazing to me. And we were there to work on a church and to help a church, which was a sanctuary for the little town. But I still feel the same way, that people, no matter their condition, do want to make things better. And in this particular project, Nehemiah was able to not only bring the people back, the expatriates that came back, and we'll see the list at the end of the night, but he also took the people that were there, and they worked on this together. Make sense? So I don't want to redo all that, because it's kind of wearisome. I do want to point out one gate in particular. It's this one, the East Gate. This East Gate is also known as the Golden Gate, or the Beautiful Gate, speculated from Acts chapter 3. This may be the Golden Gate, the Beautiful Gate. This one is very significant to the latter times. Today it looks like this. This is the East Gate. The Temple Mount is in behind the East Gate, and this was actually built probably in about 500, 600 AD. This is not how it looked in the life of Jesus. As I tried to illustrate last week, most of everything that's been built up the temple would have been behind this area. The western wall is on the opposite side of the Temple Mount, so this is the east. But you'll see the arrow splits that were made by the Ottoman Empire or something of that nature. This was probably closed up in the 1600s. And not only was it closed up, but you see all this here? This is envisioned, by the way, what it would have looked like during the time of Jesus. This is not actual, because it's closed up. This would have been the temple in the background. So in other words, it's a straight shot into the temple. Seen from the east, looking back west. This is what it is today. Here's the east gate here. And you see what all these are here? They're graveyards. And guess who put them there? Muslims did. Muslims built an entire cemetery on the eastern side of the Jerusalem East Gate because there is a prophecy. And the prophecy is, in Zechariah 14, behold, the day is coming from the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you, and I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravaged, the half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. In that day, notice Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. In that day, this would be the Lord, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in the front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. So due east from the Temple Mount, due east from the east gate, across the Kidron Valley, which falls down and then comes back up, is the Mount of Olives. Now, what's interesting about this is the reference to, in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. The Lord's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. And when that happens, the mount will split. And we read in other passages, the valley will be raised, and he will walk into the city from the east. Now, that's Zechariah 14, verse 4. There's another passage, Acts 1. This is when Jesus ascends. 40 days after his resurrection. After he said these things, he lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky, while he was going, in other words, it was a process. You can only imagine, you're with Christ, and he's lifted up, and you're watching him. It says, as he was going, they were gazing. As he was going, or while he was going, behold, 2 men in white clothing stood beside them. 2 guys show up. So the apostles are with him. He's ascended. And 2 guys show up. Reminds me very much of the men at the tomb. He is not here. They also said, men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus, who had been taken up from you into heaven, will come in just the same way as you watched him go into heaven. Jesus bodily was ascended into heaven. And this passage, according to these 2 witnesses and other Old Testament prophecy, says he will return in the same way in which he left. So the Lord will descend, and he will do what? His feet will land. Notice where they were. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. Where were they? On the Mount of Olives. So after Jesus had been raised from the dead in Jerusalem, they went to Galilee. He met them there. Peter is restored at the end of John's Gospel. We know that the Great Commission from Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20 was actually issued in Galilee. And then they made a trip back to Jerusalem. And at the end, they go across the Kidron Valley in the same place he was betrayed by Judas. Now he ascends, and the announcement is made. He's coming back in the same way as he left. This is the anticipation of Zechariah 14:4. This confirms that Jesus will, and when he comes back in the same way in which he left, then Zechariah 14:4 will be fulfilled. And what will happen to the east gate? It'll open like a garage door. It'll just part, and the Messiah will enter in from the east side, if the prophecies are to be understood as real and fulfilled. Make sense? So do the gates matter? They do, interestingly enough, even way back then, 400 years earlier. So the East Gate has got specific focus in this prophetic idea.
Did I miss it somewhere? Why the graves there? Did you say
Yeah,
that? I missed
yeah.
it?
Well, I was trying to illustrate the reason, and I'm kind of long-winded about it. Thanks for bringing me back in. There was also a cemetery in a town called Tiberias on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And it's believed that this cemetery in Tiberias would have prohibited Jesus from ever visiting Tiberias because Jesus is a holy man. And any priest or any holy man can't go where there is a cemetery. Now that's a speculation. It was later, it was believed the cemeteries were placed in such a way in Tiberias. The Muslims, knowing their perspective on holy people and dead, no holy man would have crossed cemeteries. So they put cemeteries there to keep Jesus out. He's not intimidated by a cemetery. We already see what he does in terms of raising people from the dead. He's overcome that. That's not a problem. So, and some of those things maybe you did anyway. That's a good question. So the point is that was intended to keep the Messiah of the Jews out of the city. It's really kind of a funny theological statement.
Yeah.
You know, like put up the retardant. Isn't that funny? Now on the other side of the Kidron Valley, I'm sure you've been there, the sepulcher of David is there. What all is there? Jacob? Jacob's not buried there. But on the other upslope, if you go down to the Kidron Valley, which is there's a road down at the bottom of it, as you go up toward the Mount of Olives, all of that is Jewish cemeteries. I'm sure you've seen that. And they're all above ground, and in the Jewish tradition, when there's a death, you put a stone or a rock on the cemetery, or on the sepulcher. And that's your way of saying goodbye. So you go through the cemetery, and there are rocks all over all of them. You know, we put flowers on ours. They put stones on the top of theirs. All right, so chapter 3 summarized. Chapter 3 is the listing of the people involved and the places they were rebuilding the walls. I just want to highlight there are 11 mentions of gates. There are actually 10. The sheep gate is the starting and the end is mentioned twice. And then 41 different groups are mentioned. And the first half of the chapter, the phrase next to them is used over and over again. So you have Julian, and next to him you would have Nancy, and next to him you would have Ken. So the listing is next to. In the second half of the chapter, the idea is after them, or after to them. So the idea is you're almost walking down the list and he's checking them off. Okay, after them was this group, and it's a father, son, in some cases 3 generations are there. So chapter 3 is about who showed up and where they're assigned to work. And we were introduced last week to Sanballat. We'll see him again tonight. So now when it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria. I'm always interested to note the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria. He's called in as chips. Sanballat, as we saw last week, was probably Samaritan. And the wealthy men are going to be able to finance his opposition. These are people of influence. He spoke in the presence. He said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? Can we revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones?" If you were to burn a rock or anything, sometimes it would break down and turn into dust. So the idea is it's been burned beyond use. It would just break up and not be strong enough. Now, Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, "Even what if they were building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down." In other words, it's so feeble, they're just mocking and being derisive of their work that it can't even hold up a fox. There's a play on words here because in the back of, in the Jewish literature during the time of Solomon, in the Song of Solomon in chapter 2, he talks about catching the foxes while the vineyard is in bloom. Catch the little foxes that are ruining the vineyard. The idea is that you keep the walls up to keep the foxes out. And here the reference is to mock the Jewish tradition, which is foxes are going to tear down your place. So it's an allusion back to chapter 2:15 of Song of Solomon. So what's his response? Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return their reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Nehemiah doesn't hold back. It's an imprecatory prayer. You know what an imprecatory prayer is? As they intended to me, may it happen to them. Do not forgive their iniquity. That sounds a lot different than Jesus on the cross, doesn't it? Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. You don't see that here. And let not their sin be blotted out before you, which is exactly what God does to our sin. For they have demoralized the builders. Nehemiah takes no prisoners. This is a tough prayer here. Can we take our Bibles and go to Psalm 139? I'd like you to see something that I find in one of the most intimate Psalms. Nancy was just talking about this earlier tonight. Look at Psalm 139. I have for a long time wanted to talk about this. I'm glad we got a chance to do this tonight. The psalm is constructed in such a way that there are stanzas. I think I've tried to illustrate that every 6 verses is a stanza. So verses 1 through 6 is the first stanza. Verses 7 through 12 is the second. Verses 13 through 18 is the third, and so on and so forth. But I'd like you to note that, look at verse 17. So Psalm 139, verse 17. Look, off the script, I don't have here. I'd like you to see his heart. After we've already seen the intimacy of his Creator, he says this: How precious also are thy thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. It's a real personal, intimate expression of David to his Creator. How precious are your thoughts. He had read the law. He had heard from God. So he's grateful. It's a very intimate relationship that he has with him. Now look at verse 19. Oh, that thou slayest, or excuse me, oh, that thou wouldst slayest the wicked, O God. That's a gear change. God, kill him. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate thee, O Lord? Listen to the language. And do I not loathe those who rise up against thee? And the answer would be yes. I hate them and I loathe them. Verse 22, I hate them with the utmost hatred. It's untethered hatred. They have become my enemies. I would say of all the language in David, verses 19 through 22 is the most violent. It's the heart unveiled of his intense hatred for the enemies of God. If we're honest, we have to figure out, why is David so intently so intent in his hatred of the enemies of God here? So, especially with the sweet language we see throughout this entire psalm. Now, it only gets worse for me in the next verse, in verse 23. This is the verse we all memorize. For some reason, we skipped the previous 4. And they're strongly connected. I've never figured out why we don't do a better job connecting these things. Notice verse 23. Yes, the director's cut. It's the pastor's cut. That's what it is. Or the counselor's cut, maybe. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me. David, I can give you 4 verses of evidence of a hurtful way in you. You just want them all dead. You loathe them. It's a severe and intense hatred. So now you're saying to the Lord, see if there's any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. I can answer this question. The question is why is this here? These 4 verses, followed by these 2 verses that we've memorized in light of this very intimate psalm about how wonderful is our Creator, that He searched me and known me, and know when I set out and rise up, understand my thoughts from afar, you scrutinize my path, are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there was a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, thou dost know it all. I mean, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I mean, it's the most intimate of psalms. But it's also got the strongest hateful language of any psalm that David has. So riddle me this. What do you think of that? What do you make of that? What do you do with the 4 verses that I've just mentioned? And I'm dead serious. Victoria?
And God does get angry when we do, especially if people that are sinning against his people and enslaving his people, and that God does get angry. So if David is so close to the heart of God, then he's going to feel the same anger that God does. He's that in step with it, where he said, basically, what you love, I love what you hate, I hate. He's just going to be so like locked up into the heart of God that he's going to feel the same way. That's how I would read it.
Okay. So the intimacy with the Lord produces a sentiment toward those who would oppose whom you love.
It seems like a warrior mentality communicated in that way Christ is.
There's a scene in David's life when Nabal, the fool, has thought lowly of David and wouldn't pay tribute. And David is hot to go get him. And Nabal's wife, Abigail, comes out and says, David, don't do this. This is a bad idea. And he goes, okay. And he's really wise. And he backs off. And Nabal, then she goes home and says, Nabal, you fool. This is what you've done. And I told David, don't do what he was going to do. And he was overcome by it and dies of a heart attack. So David got both. You know, he got Nabal dead and he ended up with Abigail. But, you know, the point is that David, your point, Ed, is that David was a warrior. So what was our first introduction to David was what? I'll take care of this Goliath. I've killed the lion and the bear. This giant's nothing. I've done this before. So his first inclination is the moment he hears God's name being cursed, what's he going to do? He goes into attack mode. Attack mode. Pastor, Ken, what do y'all think?
Is this a yes or no, or is this?
That was a really negative. I didn't give you a yes or no. You got a lot of room, Pastor Mike. You got a lot of room.
Well, I noticed the first 2 verses of the same chapter begin with. He confesses what he latter asked for. So his first words are, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." So he begins the chapter with the confession of faith, believing that God is what he is, and you know everything that I do, my thoughts before I think them, you know that. And then I think, as Victoria says, I think he really elevates the power and grace and closeness of the Lord with his people. And that in that righteousness, in that being angry and sin not state of mind, keep in mind we can separate old from new, and the mindset certainly are changed from New Testament grace to Old Testament vengeance that we find oftentimes as God used the nation of Israel as a type of what he wants to do to the whole world. So there had to be an enemy or an animosity there to set the nation of Israel apart from the rest of the world. So I think he has a right as a type of what God is doing even in the last days. He came not to condemn the world, but the world that he might be saved. That there will be a day when he will separate the sheep from the goats. And there will be and we may not like that idea that God would actually cast anybody down and out, but the scripture is pretty clear that God does have the ability and is withholding to this day his grace and mercy that all men might come to know him. But there will be a day when that sense of vengeance and vindication of his righteousness will certainly be visited again upon the earth as it was in Noah's day. So I'm kind of with Victoria on this. It looks like to me there's a real open-heartedness, completely beyond bounds of his confession of God's goodness. And yet I love him so much, I hate these people that don't see it like I see it. And let's straighten this thing out. And we, preachers sometimes get into that mode and Elijah modes and, cast them out and cast them down and let them see the backside of God's hand. But it is a completely, the extremes of grace and mercy
Very much.
sandwiched with knowledge is, I don't know.
No, I think it's critical. I think it's important to recognize that any of us, and I'm going to step out of the world for just a moment of the Old Testament and the New Testament, just let's step into the room for a moment. These aren't in violation of each other. The moment you want to pick a fight, cuss someone's beloved. That's easy. I can get a fight in a second. Okay? Yeah. My point being is that we naturally understand those whom we love, we will defend against the threat of attack or a slander. You know, in other words, cuss a man's wife and watch what happens. If the man's a real man and he's going to defend his wife, you would expect that from him, would you not? I guarantee you, these guys might just not even have a dispute about that.
Very facts.
Yeah.
Very facts.
Yeah. So I'm saying on a very base level. That's a base level. But I'm really, and I appreciate, Victoria, your comment. Intimacy solicits protection. And intimacy solicits defense. Because you've knitted your heart to someone. And it's natural to defend. And if I could borrow for just a moment, the tension of the Old Testament, as we see in these 4 verses of Psalm 139, we see it come to fruition in the garden where Jesus was betrayed when Peter picks up the sword and goes after Malchus and flips off his ear. He Van Gogh'd him. Okay? That's an art joke. And what does Jesus say? That's not how we fight. So the New Testament ethic is now you pray for forgiveness of your enemies and you don't pick up the sword. And if someone strikes you on your cheek, you turn the other cheek. That's why the Jews had such a problem with what Jesus was saying. Not just Jews, but keep in mind, he came to them first. And what is their history? They were warriors. Such was David that when he wanted to build the temple, God said, no, you're a man of blood. You don't get to do that. Your son will do that. And what is his son's name? Even though he was idolatrous, we know he was a mess. He was peaceful. It's the idea of peace. David was beloved. Solomon was peace. He was beloved of Yahweh, but he was not the man of war that David was. David was a warrior. So you would expect warriors to talk like this. May I offer something even just as true? People who have been in battles are wearied of opposition. And quite frankly, if you're beat down, anybody can say something to you and you've got a quick trigger. And you are always looking for a fight. Not that you want to, but that's your mindset. You'll recall in Judges chapter 6, Gideon is this humble, least of the brethren in the smallest tribe, and the Lord shows up into him and he says, hey, oh valiant warrior. He goes, who are you talking to? I'm beating out my wheat in the wine press. I'm hiding. Who are you talking to? He goes, well, if this is true, then why is all this bad stuff happening? And God says, I've called you to do my work for me. 2 chapters later, Gideon is in hot pursuit of the enemy. And guess what happens when anybody hesitates to join him in the fight? He's going to come back and kill him. He has no patience for anyone who pauses. But at the beginning of his own ministry, in the beginning of the story, Gideon is very uncertain. Matter of fact, he's got the 2 fleeces because he wants to make sure. He needs proof twice. Maybe I got it wrong. Let me check the other way. He's full of doubt and suspicion. And God capitulates to his doubt and suspicion. But Gideon won't do that with anyone else. He is demanding and he's a tyrant. Why? Because he's been in the fight. And anyone who's been in the fight has a fighting mentality. And the first thing you'll do is go to the flesh. Nehemiah is in battle. So you can see where they're mocking him He's doing the Lord's work. This is a man who traveled all the way from Susa in Persia and come all the way home and rallied all the people together, and 2 negative people approaching, and now he's praying for vengeance. Isn't that amazing? I get it. Okay? But it's a far cry from what we see in the Lord, which even magnifies what Jesus was saying even more. In the New Testament, as Pastor Mike talked about in the age of grace, what a difference that is. But we understand the sentiment, don't we?
Could we say then, in light of that what God has done through Israel, his mercies were unending to Israel. That was so that all the promises of the Old Testament were to that nation, and in tension against all the other nations of the world, that he set a people as a light to the rest of the world, what God's mercy, grace, power, continually enduring grace to them, that now he has turned that from one nation to the entire universe. That now the real enemy of the soul, which is the enemy, which is Satan himself and the power of sin, which he destroys at the cross, so that everything that he spoke to a nation, now he's spoken to the entire world, that now we're all under the same covering. All that are in Christ have that in Christ. Every promise is yea and amen in him. So all the promises of the Old Testament now have been fulfilled in Christ. And we in the world, though we be not Jewish by nature, we have the Jewish promise and connection to the inheritance of what the others have. Is that so that we all can realize now, whether we're black, white, rich or poor, Jewish background or redheaded stepchildren, whatever we are, we all have become a partaker of the divine nature that God gave from the beginning to Abraham, that through Isaac all of his seed would follow through. And I sense that is a really kind of an overarching part of evangelism, so that we exclude no one at the table of grace, and that God is, with all of his extensions of himself for 4,000 years with that Old Testament type, has now shown himself in the deepest of mercy, that regardless of our past, of our background, God has again thrown the entire net of grace to the world. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. What he did with Israel, he has now spoken to us. And I say that is probably, there's not a more magnanimous, revolutionary thought of what God for so long has selected as one people, above all peoples, has now said, all people are my people, and loves us all. And that's fathomless to the depths of what God has done. That separation with Samaritan and the Jews, that great distinction between those two. They had no connection, no fellowship. You couldn't touch or be in the same room or realm together. And now God has removed all those divisions and all those barriers, has now brought us all together as one. And that is the mercy and depths of God's grace. It's powerful. It's I can say, to me, it is to just think of how far God has gone in bringing all men to salvation, with all of our sinfulness and everybody born in sin, that God has extended this mercy. It's enough to cause any minister of the gospel, or anyone who receives or even meditates, should tremble at the depths, gravity, and profoundness of this word. It shakes the comprehension of a man that God could do what he did simply at the faith and belief of a human being. Not his merits, but what God has done in the operation of God when he gave his son and rose him from the grave. What this has made possible to us is enough to make you tear up just thinking about it. The depths of God's love. All men may know life and purpose and reason again. And it resonates as you speak the word tonight. Let us never get and be locked into history so that we miss the power of its intent. It is a spiritual concept all the way through.
Yeah, I think that's very important to consider. When you look at these two verses, 4 and 5, you can see this is a tough one. Return their reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you. They've demoralized the builders. We could pray something, I'm going to show you this at the end, but what do we do with opposition? And how do we respond? Well, we can see here, he prays. The content of the prayer, we may take some New Testament perspective and see it much differently, but notice, hear, O our God. Okay? Now, I can tell you the heavy heart. You want some justice, don't you? Let the wrong be righted. That's what he's saying. Return the reproach on their own heads. In other words, let them eat their own fodder. Let it come back to them. Now, I don't want to get into all the detail and the theology of that in particular, but just notice, the response is pray. God, deal with my opposition. Now, he's very specific. We've already heard him say to Artaxerxes, send me to Judah. Nehemiah is really good about, listen, really straightforward. And now he's going to be just as equally straightforward. We would take exception to some of the language for our time, but nevertheless, he prays. All right, so here's his answer. We built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together in half its height, for the people had a mind to work. I love it. Let's pray and pass the gunpowder. That would be our equivalent today. Okay? In other words, we're going to pray, trust God, and we're going to go to work. It's a perfect blend of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Now, when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on and the breaches began to close, they were very angry. Bullies think you're going to respond to their first threat. When you're persistent, they are persistent. All of them conspired together to come fight against Jerusalem and to cause a disturbance in it. But we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. I'd like you to note that they don't go on the offensive. They pray offensively, but they're on the defensive. They don't attack. So they won't engage. Thus in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. In other words, this is what people were saying. Yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall. This is what was being said in the community. Have you ever been so overwhelmed by your problem you can't imagine a way out? This is a mess. What are we going to do? Not enough money. Too many bills. Don't have what you need to take care of your house. Whatever the circumstances are, it's just overwhelming. You ever run into somebody and say, how's your day? And they just burst into tears. What is up? I'm having a bad day. Okay, whatever that means. It's like, okay, sorry I asked. I mean, it's just sometimes it's overwhelming. Now, I asked Julian, and he just cried for like ever about that. No, I'm just messing around. That's not true. That's not true. I'm just messing with him. So this was the chapter. I'm sure all of you have felt that. Okay, you've got your own challenges. You've got people carping on you about what you can't do. So this is the response. All right, our enemy said, they will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work. When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times. Now this is always what you want, is your fellow Jews to come to you 10 times and repeat what the enemy was saying. Will you stop it already? I've already heard this. 10 times, that's right. They will come up against us from every place where you turn. Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall. The exposed places I stationed the people in families with their, I love this, swords, spears, and bows. When I saw their fear, this is amazing leadership. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Why? Remember Yahweh. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Great leaders ignore the noise. They see what their people are struggling with, and they rise and they speak. And that's what he does. And what does he do once again? He had done this in chapter 2. Remember the Lord. He had prayed to the Lord, remember your people. You said you would regather us. God, will you regather us? So he's calling upon Yahweh to remember his promise. And now he's telling the people, remember. The word in Hebrew for remember is zakar. When Yahweh remembers, the last part of a name is I-A-H. And that stands for Yahweh, or Yah. So Zechariah, Zechariah, is Yahweh remembers. Make sense? In the New Testament, the name Zechariah is Zacharias. And Zacharias was married to Elizabeth, and he was the priest. And Elizabeth was old, and they had a baby named John. And old Zacharias wasn't sure that he believed, and he doubted that he and Elizabeth in their old age could have a baby. Now, there's an Old Testament example where that had happened before called Abraham and Sarah. So he shouldn't have doubted. So God muted him until John was born, and he finally said, we will call his name John. Okay, that was the judgment for his doubt. Now Mary is told, you're going to have a baby, and you're not going to know a man. And she went, oh, I'm not so sure about this. God does not judge Mary. Why? Because there's no precedent for a virgin conception and birth. So an old priest ought to know better. So Zacharias, are you ready for this? Forgot. Okay, his name is Zechariah. Now, there's a verse, and I'll ask you to look at this differently. It's, Luke chapter 1, verse 72. All three of their names are mentioned in one verse. Zechariah is Yahweh remembers, Elizabeth is covenant, and John is grace. So in one verse, God, the Lord, remembered his covenant and was merciful to the people. All three of their names are referenced in one verse. It's a magnificent statement that John is going to be the forebearer, the voice crying out in the wilderness, the Lamb of God who will take away the sin of the world. So Zechariah, God remembered his covenant and gave him grace. So when he says, remember the Lord, he's calling the people to do that. All right, are y'all patient with me? Because Julie and I are going to have a little bit of technological challenge again. We do this when we have videos. So I want to show y'all the video. Can I do this? All right, here we go. We have tried to rehearse this.
How'd that work out for you?
It's actually worked out pretty well. If we learn to count down. Let me set this up because this scene is Shakespeare's. This is a movie called Henry V, and it's literally taking, the script is taken from Shakespeare's play, Henry V. And this is the speech on the eve of St. Crispin's Day. This is a real battle that took place between the English and the French. This is the English camp, and they're about to face the French in a major battle on St. Crispin's Day. They're fearful. The English are afraid. And to illustrate the power of the leader getting up in front of the people, I thought I would illustrate it with this video clip. Remember, it's a Shakespearean English. Okay? 3, 2, 1.
Where is the king? The king himself is rode to view their battle. Of fighting men, they have full 70,000.
That's 5 to 1. Besides, they are all fresh.
These are fearful odds. Oh, that we now had here but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today.
What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? Oh, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Brother, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when this day is named, and arouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. old men forget. Then all shall be forgotten. He'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while Denny speaks that thought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. My sovereign lord, bestow yourself with speed. The French are bravely in their battle set, and will with all expedients march upon us. All things are ready if our minds be so.
Perish the man whose mind is backward now.
Thou dost not wish more help from England, cuz?
God's will, my liege. But you and I alone, without more help, can fight this royal battle.
You know your places. God be with you all.
That's a great speech, and here comes Sandball. This is the French they're attacking. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that a fun speech? If you've seen Braveheart, you'll see where Braveheart took this idea, and then we also see in The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn's speech before the Black Gate, the same idea. Great leaders step into the midst of the fear of their people, and they restore them to what they know to be true in the face of uncertainty. We see Nehemiah doing that very thing. I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. It wasn't just the people, it was the people's leaders, the nobles and the officials were fearful. In other words, the threat had come and it had magnified. And he said, no, remember the Lord. We'll notice so quickly how our attention is diverted to our threats, and we'll leave the security of our Savior. Do not be afraid of them. He is great and awesome. And then he says, fight. Thanks for bearing with me for Shakespeare. It's a great scene. It's a great movie. I highly recommend it. And I would advise reading it out loud. But do it alone until you figure out Shakespeare's patterns. It's very embarrassing. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work, the second time they returned. From that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates, and the captain were behind the whole house of Judah. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. I love it. I got a trowel in one hand and a shield in the other. I love it. As for the builders, each wore his sword girded at his side as he built, while the trumpeter stood near me. And I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. At whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. You know, he set up a plan. He had a response. Not only did he verbally address the people and stood up in front of them and reminded them theologically, remember your Lord, he's great and awesome. But he does what? He strategically deals with the threat. It's a real threat. Again, not offensive. Their job is to build a wall, not to fight the critics. It's easy to focus on the critics. And he says, no, that's not what we're here for. So that doesn't mean that he doesn't take precaution. Thus the shield and the trowel. So we carried on the work, with half of them holding spears from dawn till the stars appeared. Love that. That's a long day. The sun up till the stars appeared. And at that time I also said to the people, let each man with his servant spend the night within Jerusalem, so they may be a guard for us by night and a laborer by day. Does that sound familiar? A guard for us by night and a laborer by day. Does that sound familiar in your ear? The cloud and the fire. In other words, God will superintend our care night and day. In the wilderness wanderings, the cloud preceded them, and when the cloud moved, they moved, and behind them was the pillar of fire that protected them in the rear. The idea, they had protection both in the day with the cloud and at night with the pillar of fire. So God superintended their care against their enemies, both guiding and protecting, with those two ideas. So neither I, my brothers, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us removed our clothes. Each took his weapon even to the water. Once again, this fascinates me because the language of the Exodus appears again. The language of the water, but also we didn't remove our clothes. The Jews wandered for 40 years, and neither their clothes nor their shoes wore out. I can't get a pair of Nikes to last 2 years. In other words, there was supernatural provision for them that things didn't wear out. And you see the language almost appear in the same idea. This reminds me of the Exodus experience. All right, now, there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, we, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live. There were others who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses that we might get grain because of the famine. They're under a lot of duress. There's limited supplies of food. Also, there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, our children like their children. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters are forced into bondage already. And we are helpless because our fields and vineyards belong to others. You know what they've done? They've paid taxes and gone to debt. And they've got debts they can't get out from under. And they've had to literally mortgage their families. And now their daughters are enslaved. This is exactly what Joseph did to the Egyptians. Joseph took over during the time of the famine. And in his management of the economy of Egypt, literally, every Egyptian came to Joseph, and at some point they're coming to buy food. And he went from payment, and they had exhausted their wealth, to animals. They exhausted their animals. Land, they exhausted their land, and now he enslaved them. It's an amazing thing that Joseph, he wasn't Jewish at the time. He was the son of Abraham, the son of Isaac, the son of Jacob, is now in control of Egypt. And his economy, he basically changed the world economy in Egypt because of his management of the famine. It's always a temptation in the economy when there's drought or it creates debt in its citizens. When the economy struggles, you'll see people going to debt. Happen today? See it all the time. The problem is, this is anti-Jewish. This is Egyptian. This is Samaritan. This is Amorite. This is everybody but the Jews. This is prohibited by the law. Then I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and the rulers and said to them, you're exacting usury. This idea of usury would be what for our definitions?
Loan shark.
Pardon me?
Loan shark.
Loan sharking interest. Charging interest to your fellow man was prohibited by the law. We're using usury, each from his brother. Therefore I held a great assembly against them, and I said to them, we, according to our ability, have redeemed our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Now, would you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us? We've redeemed our brothers from exile, and we've turned right around, and you're enslaving each other. You can see the injustice. They've turned on themselves. The first enemy you have to fight is usually on the outside, but the enemy also you have to fight is on the inside. It's often said the first enemy we have to fight is ourselves. Then they were silent and could not find a word to say. Again I said, the thing which you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? And likewise I, my brothers and my servants, are lending them money and grain. Please, let us leave off this usury. Charge them what's appropriate, but don't put debt on top of that. It's interesting to go from fighting the bad guys that are threatened to stop the work to looking up and going, we've got a problem here. Please give back to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, also the 100th part of the money and of the grain, the new wine and the oil that you are exacting from them. Then they said, we will give it back, and I will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say. So I've called the priest and took an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. I also shook out the front of my garment and said, thus may God shake out from every man from his house and his possessions who does not fulfill this promise. Even thus may we be shaken out, or he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said amen. Everybody's going, yes, my debts are paid. I'm done. And they praised the Lord, and the people did according to this promise. He led a reform in the economy. He took them back to the law. This chapter is very interesting. The implication is, how do you deal with people who are in need? And how do spiritual people respond to those needs? It doesn't take long before we look at the book of Acts and we see what they did. One man in particular, Barnabas, was a classic example of a man who, on behalf of the church, sold property, brought the proceeds, gave it to the apostles. Ananias and Sapphira wanted to fake it, make it look like they were like Barnabas. In chapter 5, they sell property, they hold back a little bit, don't tell the full story. And they presented at the apostles' feet, but they were holding back. So the peer pressure of wanting to be like Barnabas produced in them covetousness. They wanted to look like something they weren't. And God dealt with them severely. The church was, at that particular point, gripped with the reality that we better do it right, and the numbers of the church grew. We see in the book of 2 Corinthians where Paul is very concerned about gathering a gift. To do what with it? To take it to Jerusalem. And he superintends the care of it, so no one would think poor of Paul and the way he administered a gift. So he wanted to do what? He wanted to give those believers, very similar to what we have here, he wanted to give those believers, those downtrodden and beat up, in debt, hungry Jews who had believed in Jesus back in Jerusalem and lost everything, was a gift to the church. The church has always been generous, and God has always blessed a generous church.
Can I read those two verses that you just
Wish you would.
alluded to? 2 Corinthians 8 and 14. But by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. That's in a perfect world, which is the kingdom of God, there is sufficiency for everybody. And I think the church certainly should reflect that generous, God-like, Christ-like mind, hospitality and kindness and goodness. That's beautiful.
I'm going to stop just as Pastor Mike has done. Other thoughts or comments, please?
I'll go back, maybe you don't have to go back a couple of screens, but back, you kind of zoomed from 4 into 5, and I know the time was short, so I know why you did that. But I love verse 9 and then a little bit later.
Of chapter 5 or 4?
4.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have brought this up later, and if that's best, that's fine too. But you made reference to it maybe in an earlier verse, but when he says, nevertheless we made a prayer unto our God and set a watch against them. You know, we prayed, but then we posted the guard. And then later he said in verse 17, get down to verse 20. And that verse ends, our God shall fight for us. Yeah. But then the next phrase in the first verse, the next verse after that is, so we labored in the work. So I love it. It reminded me of a quote by St. Augustine or Augustine that said, pray as if everything depended on the Lord, work as if everything depends on us. And I think that's a great balance in those two verses there.
That's a great point. Yeah, St. Augustine also said, it is ours to raise the sail, it is God's to bring the wind. Same notion. Moreover, from the day when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance, but the former governors who were before me, notice this, laid burdens on the people, and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Guess who else said this? The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians. He said, I've robbed from other churches because I would not take from you Y'all should have supported our ministry, but if you weren't going to do it, I wasn't going to demand anything from you. I wasn't going to take anything from you. I was not going to be a burden to you. He said, I had a right as an apostle to do that, but I didn't do it. Same idea. You see the same thing. I would not do so because of the fear of God. I also applied myself to the work on this wall. What else did Paul do? He got a job. He made tents for a season. So Nehemiah is not just saying, do this and hey, you owe me. Look what he's doing. It's incarnational leadership. I applied myself to the work of the wall. We did not buy any land, and all of my servants were gathered there for the work. My whole team showed up. Moreover, they were at my table, 150 Jews and officials besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Nehemiah had a large food bill. He's feeding a lot of people. In other words, what's he being accused of? He's saying to the folks that are taking advantage of other people, stop. We're not doing it this way. And I love this. I'm going to say something really clear about the leadership of this church. I know firsthand for several years now that the leadership of this church are the most generous leaders I've ever been involved with in any of my years in the church, who are very, very deferential to others. They're servant leaders. And you know why? Because they've read their Bible and they know Jesus. And they've actually trust Him for their needs. And what we've seen over the years is how God has multiplied ministries because they're trusting Him for the process. They will do a lot for other people, and they don't want it to be known. I have to be careful not to say too much. Truly. But it excites me, and it's a blessing to me. And again, it's very personal for saying all this. But I want to testify about what's true. I want to praise the Lord for what He's doing in the life of the leadership of this church. And it's involved at so many different places. That's why we're such an outreach people, because we're not coming to get. Nobody does that. You know where it starts? It starts with leadership. It starts with people. If I can say this, there's an old phrase from a song that I love. Those of us who must lead as we follow. Follow the King who leads with no guile. That's the test. Do you follow the one who leads with no guile? And do you look like the one you're following? So often, any organization, whether it's as simple or as small as a family, is in the image of the leader. Every organization is at some point in the image of the personality of the leader. And so it is in the church. And to that extent, that's why we get so excited about what God is doing in the ministry of this church. And that's why, if we can say it again, we make a change, we're going to go somewhere else. We're going to do a work somewhere else. It's going to be okay. Because it's not about the wall, it's about the worship. The wall is the place of protection to secure the worship. So what is a building? It's the instrument to worship. Too many people make it the other way around. Make sense? I just love this statement by Nehemiah because it reminds me so very much of what we've just finished reading in 2 Corinthians. And it's a model for us. Now, that which was prepared for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Now he's going to give the grocery list. Also, birds were prepared for me. That one makes me a little nervous. But remember the quail that God provided? Okay. I keep thinking like pigeons. Squab. And once in 10 days, all sorts of wine were furnished in abundance. Reminds me of the wedding at Cana. Yet for all this, I did not demand the governor's food allowance because the servitude was heavy on this people. Remember me, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. He was doing it for him, but he also wants to say, Lord, take care of me. Take care of this. Now, when it was reported to Sanballat, Tobiah, to Geshem the Arab, and to the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and had that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not yet set up the doors of the gate. It's kind of an interesting deal. Okay, we got the wall done, but we don't have the doors set yet. He's qualifying. Then Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, come, let us meet together at Shepharim and the plain of Ono. Any place that's called Ono, don't go there. Okay? It's oh no for a reason. Okay? Someone had been there before and went, nope, not good. But they were planning to harm me. So I sent the messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work and cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? They sent messages to me 4 times. You've heard the older guys say 10 times? They keep coming back 4 times in this manner, and I answered them in the same way. This idea, come meet with us, and he knew what their motives were. Listen, I'm doing a great work, cannot come down. Once again, the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says that a pastor cannot engage himself in the everyday affairs of this world because like a soldier, he needs to be dedicated to his work. If you put his hand to a plow, don't take it away. Distraction is one of the greatest detriments to ministry. Okay? You got to know what you're all about. You're doing great work. I cannot come down. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me in the same manner a 5th time with an open letter in his hand, and it was written, it is reported among the nations that Gazmu says that you and the Jews are planning to rebel, therefore you are rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king according to these reports. Now we know what you're really about. It's just your blind ambition. So there's slander. If you can't get them to meet with you, just slanderize them. Ed?
I just thought it was just so interesting. The one thing they don't want him to do is be on the wall, and he sends a message to him, I'm doing a great work. How can I come down?
Yeah, that's right. Have any of you ever been slandered? Anybody ever been slandered by someone?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. If they can't get you to quit, they'll just smear your name. And they will charge you with things that aren't true.
Yep.
All right. You have also appointed prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you, a king is in Judah. They're saying that Nehemiah has got his spokesman. Today we would say that they're spokesmen. They're PR people. And they're issuing press releases. And the press release would read, a king is in Judah, and Nehemiah is going to claim the throne. Now who's going to care about that? Artaxerxes. So in other words, Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah home, and Nehemiah now is going to set himself up as king, and Artaxerxes is not going to like that. So what the intention of this statement is it would get back to Artaxerxes. And now it will be reported to the king, according to these reports. In other words, we make up a story, we're going to report the story as true, and now you put Nehemiah on the defensive, and you put doubt and suspicion in the mind of Artaxerxes. And now he's commissioned this man. And what's going to happen is Artaxerxes now doubts whether it's real. It's pretty obvious. So come now. Let us take counsel together. He's blackmailing him. Let's talk. You won't come talk to me? You doing this great work? I think you better come talk to me. Then I sent a message to him saying, how do you respond? Such things as you were saying have not been done, but you're inventing them in your own mind, for all of them are trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work and it will not be done. But now, oh God, as Ken has already noted earlier, strengthen my hands. I love this phrase. You are inventing them in your own mind. You're out of your mind. In other words, don't respond. Don't take it as something you've got to be defensive about. You know, don't be distracted from a great work, and don't be distracted by having to defend yourself. One of the great things about opposition is it purifies your motives and your actions. If you're not committed, opposition will cause you to flee. If you're committed, it'll purify your actions. But don't be distracted.
It goes back to what you were saying too. They weren't offensive in it. They were defensive in it. A lot of times when opposition comes, you get so defensive minded that you go find opposition. So you go find what everybody's saying and what everybody's doing. Instead of fighting ghosts, just fight what's there. I think they were saying you're making it up in your own mind. So you can go say whatever you want to say. There's real things that I'm fighting, and having to fight ghosts might actually distract me from what I'm supposed to be fighting. Fighting ghosts, I like that. Fighting ghost. When I was coaching, we'd talk about don't defend the ghost. In other words, the what if. Can I say it in a
similar way, we'll create the world we fear. Don't do that. Don't let fear create that world. Well, it continues. When I entered the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Tabel, who was confined at home, he said, "Let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you at night." Now it's gone from slander to the threat of death. They're going to assassinate you. But I said, "Should a man like me flee?" I love this phrase. Like me. Wonder what kind of man is that guy? Like me. What kind of man is he? Like me. Should a man like me flee?
Are we supposed to answer?
Well, yeah.
Courageous, bold, he will not be manipulated, which I love, and he is a leader, not only of others, but of himself. So what's the concern? Also, understanding and knowing and remembering who Jehovah is. What can man do unto me? Good luck.
So if that's who I am, should I flee? Can I say this is the basis for if you know who you are, you'll live different. But you better get it right. If you know who you are in Christ, you're a new creation. The old has passed away. So what kind of person are you? Like me? See, I love that idea. As simple as it is, it's very profound, is do we know who we are? I heard a testimony from an Iranian this morning that as a young child, he left home because the Iraqis are bombing his hometown in western Iran. And at 15, he left to go to Tehran. And in Tehran, while worshiping Allah, he had gotten to the place of the darkness of his own life, and he hated everything about what he was feeling, that he was ready to commit suicide in 1 week before he was going to kill himself. In his words, commit jihad. Religion without faith is dead, and death creates death. And anyone who says they are the Son of God needs to be destroyed. So influenced by the teaching of the Quran, he is ready to kill, but it was himself, because he's with his brothers in Tehran. Walking through the street, he's part of the army, headed to his post, he hears the words, "Go talk to that man there, he is a Christian." He walks up to a total stranger and he says, "Are you a Christian?" The man says, "Yes." He goes, "I've been told to come talk to you." He says, "What are you a part of?" He goes, "What are you asking me?" "Are you a Christian?" He said, "Yes, I'm part of the underground church." "Where is it?" He gives him directions. 2 days later, he finds the church. He finds the pastor in the underground church in Tehran. And he says, "This man told me where you are." And the pastor goes, "Who told you?" He goes, "I described him." He said, "We know no one like that." And while he was in the service, his heavy, dark heart let go. He heard the grace of Christ. He believed, became a Christian. He fell out in tears, his heart fulfilled in Christ. And the pastor said, "Read this book," and gave him a Farsi Bible. He said, "Start in the middle." He started in Matthew. He said, "Muslims believe that Jesus is a prophet." He said, "This is no prophet. Jesus is no prophet. He is the Son of God, and I believe in Jesus." It was chilling. So the man like me now is different. So what does he do? He preaches the gospel in Iran. He's been arrested and in prison 4 times because he's a man like Christ. So what are you? What will a man or a woman like you do? Flee? No. I love that phrase. Julie?
No lukewarm Christians in the Middle East, you can't. But he said opposition will purify.
Truly does.
So no lukewarm Christians.
By the way, this language here about fleeing to the temple, you'll be killed there, is exactly what Paul was told in his experience in the book of Acts. There's a plot to kill you. And could one such as I go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. I'm not going to flee to the sanctuary to hide. I'm going to trust God in the streets. Nancy?
Do scriptures stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, and having done all to stand therefore? What comes to mind?
Super. Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, this him being this guy, all right? But he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He was hired for this reason, that I may become frightened and act accordingly in sin, so that they may have an evil report in order that they could reproach me. Remember, oh my God, I love every section ends the same way. Tobiah and Sanballat, according to their works of theirs, and also Noadiah, the prophetess, and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. Wave after wave after wave, he stays the same. Remember me, O God. Remember the Lord. Keeps coming. Don't worry about it. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month of Elul in 52 days. When all of our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence. They would not be beat. For they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Also in those days, many letters went from the nobles of Judah to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him because he was the son-in-law, basically had intermarried, had alliances, and now they're going back and forth. We got a problem. Moreover, they were speaking about his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. Then Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. One more time he tries. Now, don't worry, we're near the end. It's going to go fast. Now when the wall was rebuilt, and I'd set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, and the singers, and the Levites were appointed, then I put Hananiah, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. Then I said to him, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be open until the sun is hot. And while they were standing guard, they shut them and bolt the doors. Also appoint guards in the inhabitants of Jerusalem, each at his post, and each in front of his own house. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built. Then I put my God into my heart to assemble the nobles. Then my God put it in my heart, the officials and the people, and enrolled by genealogies. I love this. He went back to Ancestry.com. Then I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up first, in which I was found in the following record. These are the people of the province that came up from the captivity of the exiles, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, carried away and returned to Jerusalem, Judah, into its own city. Now he mentions all the people who come in earlier to build the temple, and the number of the men of people of Israel is, watch this, I'm going to go fast now. How about verses 8 through 65? The sons of the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, the sons of Solomon's servants, the whole assembly together, 42,360 Jews. Listed. Some more details. Some from among the heads of the fathers' households gave to the work. The governor gave to the treasurer 1,000 gold drachmas, 50 basins, 530 priest garments. Some of the heads of the fathers' household gave into the treasury the work 20,000 gold drachmas, 2,200 silver minas. That which the rest of the people gave was 20,000 gold drachmas, 2,000 silver minas, and 67 priest garments. Basically, they rebuilt the economy of the town, the city of Jerusalem. It's amazing, isn't it? 42,000 people came back. A lot of people. And all this stuff. They had singers, they had horses, they had mules. This one cracks me up. They had 435 camels. They had 6,700 donkeys. They had that one covered. All right, that's the end of chapter 7. I got us there. Well, except for this part. Now the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the temple servants, and all of Israel lived in their cities. And then, or when the 7th month came, the sons of Israel were in their cities. Close the book at that point. Now it continues, and we'll do this later. Are y'all okay for 5 more rounds? Because I want to draw some principles, if I can do this. By the way, remember they started here? 52 days later, the whole project is concluded. It's an amazing project. What did somebody say last week? It takes us more than 50 days to get a permit today? Yeah, Julian said that, I think. Expect opposition to your work. It will produce anger and ridicule. Take the offense to the Lord in prayer. We worry so much about what we're facing. Be anxious for nothing, Jesus says. Pray for God to accomplish His will and to check the opposition. We've seen this earlier. Just let God deal with your enemies. He'll take care of them. If you're doing his work, he will deal with the enemies. We see this real strong, as Pastor Mike had said earlier in the New Testament. The battle is the Lord's. Do not let criticism distract from the work. I tell you, it's one of the greatest things is we let it, like a worm, get in our ear and get in our brain as a word of criticism. And we can't get rid of it. I guarantee you, if I ask you to tell me somebody that's criticized you and you're still thinking about it, I guarantee you can remember it. Don't think about it now. Stop. It comes right back, doesn't it? By the way, well, never mind. Okay, take wise and protective care to protect the work. I think one of the great things that we feel as leadership is that our job is to set a mood and set an environment for work to be done in the ministry. We see this in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Ephesians, where the role of leadership is to equip the saints for the work of service. I mean, what a great opportunity to create an environment, to set the boundaries, so to speak, that you know where the ministry is, and you know you're supported and protected. I think it's the role of a man in a home to protect the family. I think that comes all the way down. Spiritual leaders need to speak up and encourage the people in the face of threats. He called out, remember, and fight. Now, we know it. They didn't ever fight. The Jews never fought. There was a lot of threats and there was a lot of saber rattling. But they never fought. They were prepared, but they never fought. They blew a trumpet. Hey, we need help over here. Okay, they showed up. The challenges of leadership are never ending. Well, that's encouraging. Okay, the moment the external challenges are done, they'll be replaced by internal ones. Take this from the idea that you're fighting Sanballat and Tobiah and the other guys, but you look around and you've got your own people extracting usury from each other. Stop. So he cleans up the external mess and he deals with the internal mess. Like I said, very often, one of the greatest challenges is internal. I mean, that's one of the struggles we see in the New Testament, the founding of the church. It was one thing for the Romans and the Jews, Jewish leaders, to kill Jesus. And they opposed the apostles. They eventually killed James in chapter 12. But what did God have to deal with first? Had to deal with the church's covetousness in Acts chapter 5. It shows up quite early. Number 8, do not involve yourselves in things that distract from the work. Okay, I would like to notice the difference between 4 and 8. Don't let criticism distract from the work, and don't involve yourselves in things that distract from the work. It's one of the great time wasters. Okay, how many of you have noticed how technology is a distraction? Wait, did I hear a text? What was that? Let me check. Hang on. You know, that quick for distraction. Yeah, right. Opponents will exaggerate your ambitions to raise doubt with other leaders. Infighting is what that is. It's not unusual to have someone represent you what you're really all about. I had an occasion this week to talk with someone who had just left a job after 5 faithful years of service in a ministry to go to a new ministry. 2 months after having moved, they were called into the CEO's office and released without cause. It's not a good fit. What had happened is that 3 people had conspired against the person I'm talking to misrepresent what their ambitions were, and had persuaded the CEO that this person was trying to change things internally, and they had crossed someone, the wrong someone, and the wrong someone conspired to get rid of them, and in 2 months they were gone. So they sought my counsel about what do we do with this. And then you realize Christian ministries can be just like any other organization. Unfortunately. So I said there's a serious issue with this Christian ministry and God has spared you by removing it. So dust off your feet, sharpen your resume, and send it to me. We'll see what God does with that. And then, one of the things that I love in chapter 7 is that Nehemiah, and I've skipped over it, but you know what Nehemiah does? Is he accounts for the success of the work by mentioning everyone that was a part of it. We've seen all of their names. We've seen what everybody did, all the way from chapter 3 to chapter 7. I skipped over a lot, but the fact of the matter is he's naming names. One of the highlights that we get to have a conversation is what people do in our church. And we never want to promote the flesh for selfishness, but we want to promote service. And we're so excited by seeing the number of people that serve. One of the great things we get to talk about is what is God doing in the life of so-and-so? And what are they doing to further the ministry of the gospel of Jesus Christ? So we want to account for the success of the work. Not in a fleshly way success, but the accomplishment of a purpose that God has raised us up to. Whether it's evangelism, whether it's taking care of somebody, whether it's teaching, whatever the needs are. So you'll hear Pastor Jason, Pastor Mike, can at length talk about what God is doing with the ministries of the church. Because we want to do number 10. It's quite a difference, isn't it? From opposition to account for the success of the work. Because you know what? The battle is the Lord's. I'm done.
Praise the Lord. Awesome. Anything to add, sir?
Yeah, as much as I love the encouragement to pray, we don't get any better encouragement than that. I felt like possibly the two strongest words on the whole page were the first two: expect opposition. You know, the great theologian Taylor Swift said, "Hater is going to hate." And if we ain't doing something right, then nobody's going to be criticizing and complaining. So, in the work of the ministry, I believe that we do spend an awful lot of time responding to criticism. When Nehemiah is an example of somebody that just directly confronted it and then got right back to the work. Just called it out for what it was. You're making it up. You're fabricating. You're lying. Pardon me, I'm going back to work. So sometimes we just waste an awful lot of time chasing ghosts, fighting ghosts, whatever those things are. Mr. Mike?
Sometime tell me what the significance of 52 days means. It's a pretty short time to do accomplish a lot. I know the number is significant, and so when we have a chance and we're fasted for a few days, we'll talk.
Anything else? Any questions? Any comments? Yes, ma'am.
I would add to what Ken said, be strong. Be made of steel. Be strong in the Lord. Let them hit you. It's all right. Get up. Keep going. Let them say what they want to say. All right. Get up. Keep going. Be strong. That I would say, find your steel.
That's the cost of leadership. If you're in the crowd, you don't get hit. Once you step out to do what God has called you to do, you're an easy target. Anything else?
I think too, the expecting opposition part, it's helpful for me because I think a lot of times I think if I'm having opposition, maybe I stepped outside of God's will, maybe I'm in some kind of sin. I go to like, well, what did I do wrong? And if that might not be it, there might just be opposition that we have to work through. But I think it's easy for us to put it on ourselves that we're doing something wrong or we're not hearing correctly from God if there's an opposition.
That's actually a good thing to do. We should examine ourselves first before we go poking our finger in other people's eyes. I like criticism. I also might be kept in check. Otherwise, I'll be making myself in my own mind if I'm not getting criticism. Now, being able to filter between what's constructive criticism and what's just plain old opposition. Well, when you're able to differentiate between the two and explain why what somebody's saying is valid or invalid, now we're stronger in our knowledge and our faith in God's word, and God's promises, and God working in our lives, correct? And that's how I see it. I don't.
But to echo what Vic said in a different way, what Victoria said, I think sometimes you do get introspective when opposition comes, and you start questioning.
Yeah, don't implode.
You either start questioning whether you're in the will of God, or you start questioning your abilities in that point. And I love what you said. If you expect the opposition first, you're validated before the opposition comes. So when the opposition comes, it doesn't question you. Am I outside of God's will, or did I do something wrong? So it's to be introspective is to kind of turn in and lose sight of the assignment and the work. And I think that's the enemy's attempt, so I agree.
I would say there's a difference between criticism and honesty. What we need is honesty with ourselves and with others. Criticism is the intent. Is the intent to destroy, and that has no place in a believer's life, either externally or internally. When you are criticizing yourself and constantly holding yourself to a standard of perfection, then you are living a legalistic life. You may not be living in the legal things like don't do this and don't do that, but if you're constantly criticizing yourself, you're living outside of grace, and you're living under the legalism, which we've been freed from. So criticism has no place in our life. We're to cast it out, like we're to cast out fear. Well, I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, and I'm afraid of this, and what if they say this about me? And that constant criticism is an inhibitor to our real work, and that is the ministry of others. But yes, I believe there should be honesty. You should be honest, but when someone's being honest with you, it comes from a motivation of love. Speak the truth in love, which is not criticism. Criticism is the enemy, and we are to not pay attention to it, don't give heed to it, and don't allow it in your life.
Purpose, you said, the thing you said most important is what's the purpose behind it? What's the motivation behind the heart? Is it to edify, to build up, or is it to destroy? That's so good. I love it. Anything else? A lot of wisdom going on around here. I like it. I like it. Mr. Johnson, thank you for leading us tonight. Thank you thank you, elders, for your words as well. Mr. Williams, will you pray for us as we leave tonight, sir?
Amen. Father, I want to thank you for bringing us together today and under the wisdom and leadership of our pastor and leaders of the church. And we thank you for the instruction that you placed before us. And I pray, Father, that we will take it and meditate on it as we go out and have an understanding of who we are in you, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are children of God, and we are joint heirs with Jesus Christ. Thank you again for this time together. It's in your name